In March of 1984, 12 elderly residents of Sunset Manor Retirement Home vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine day trip to Death Valley National Park. The group, ranging in age from 68 to 82, had boarded their chartered bus that Tuesday morning with packed lunches and cameras, excited for their supervised excursion to see the desert wildflowers in bloom. When darkness fell and they failed to return for dinner, staff members began making worried phone calls. By midnight, park rangers had launched a full-scale search and rescue operation across thousands of square miles of unforgiving desert terrain. But 21 years later, two experienced hikers would stumble upon something in an unmapped side canyon that would finally answer the questions that had haunted families, investigators, and an entire community for more than 2 decades. What they discovered, preserved by Death Valley's merciless but perfect conditions, would reveal a truth so devastating that it would forever change how we understand the vulnerability of our most treasured citizens and the deadly consequences of a single moment's miscalculation in one of the planet's most hostile environments. The story of the Sunset Manor disappearance begins not with that fateful March morning, but months earlier in the retirement home's cheerful community room, where activities coordinator Sophia Brown was pinning colorful brochures to the bulletin board. Sophia had worked at Sunset Manor for 6 years, and she'd made it her mission to ensure that the facility's residents experienced life beyond the beige walls and scheduled meal times that defined their daily existence. Her spring activities calendar was ambitious, featuring museum trips, theater outings, and scenic tours, designed to remind her elderly charges that their stories weren't over simply because they required assisted living. The Death Valley excursion had been Sophia's pride and joy, a full-day adventure that would take residents through some of California's most stunning desert landscapes during the brief window when winter rains transformed the normally barren valley floor into a carpet of wildflowers. She'd spent weeks coordinating with local tour guides, securing the necessary permits, and arranging for a certified bus driver who specialized in senior group transportation. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from departure times to bathroom breaks to dietary accommodations for diabetic residents. Sophia's dedication to creating meaningful experiences for Sunset Manor's residents stemmed from her own relationship with her grandmother, who had spent her final years in a similar facility in San Francisco. Sophia remembered visiting every Sunday and watching her grandmother's eyes light up whenever she described the world beyond the nursing home walls. Those memories drove Sophia's conviction that elderly residents deserved adventures, not just comfort and safety. The 12 residents who signed up for the trip represented a cross-section of Sunset Manor's community, each bringing their own hopes and histories to the adventure. Harold Brennan, 74, had been a postal worker for 38 years, walking the same route through San Bernardino's residential neighborhoods in all weather conditions. His wife, Helen, had been his anchor for 49 years, and her death from cancer the previous autumn had left him adrift in a world that suddenly seemed colorless and purposeless. Harold rarely spoke during meals and spent most of his time sitting by his window, watching cars pass on the street below. When Sophia posted the Death Valley announcement, something about the promise of wildflowers and open spaces stirred a memory of camping trips he and Helen had taken in their younger years. Harold's daughter Patricia lived in Phoenix and called every Sunday, their conversations following predictable patterns of health updates and weather reports. She'd been quietly desperate to find something that might rekindle her father's interest in living. When he mentioned the Death Valley trip, during one of their calls, his voice carried a spark of enthusiasm she hadn't heard since her mother's funeral. Patricia encouraged him to go, even offering to drive down and join the trip, but Harold insisted he wanted to do this on his own. Dorothy Kimmel, 78, had been a high school principal for 27 years before retirement, commanding respect from students, teachers, and parents through a combination of fairness, intelligence, and unwavering standards. Dorothy possessed the kind of formidable personality that could quiet a rowdy cafeteria with a single glance. But beneath her stern exterior lay a deep curiosity about the natural world that had been suppressed during decades of administrative responsibilities. She'd always promised herself that retirement would bring time for exploration and learning, though the reality of aging had proven more limiting than she'd anticipated. Dorothy's roommate at Sunset Manor was Eleanor Vasquez, a quiet woman who had spent her career as a seamstress in Los Angeles' garment district. Eleanor spoke softly and moved through the world with an apologetic demeanor that made her nearly invisible in group settings. She'd never married, having devoted herself to caring for her aging parents, and then finding herself too set in her ways to seek companionship. The Death Valley trip terrified Eleanor, who rarely ventured beyond Sunset Manor's familiar boundaries, but Dorothy's insistence that the fresh air would do them both good had worn down her resistance. The dynamic between Dorothy and Eleanor reflected the complex relationships that developed within assisted living communities. Dorothy had taken Eleanor under her wing, recognizing in the smaller woman's withdrawn nature a kindred spirit who simply needed encouragement to engage with life. Eleanor, for her part, drew strength from Dorothy's confidence while providing the gentle companionship that reminded Dorothy she was still needed and valued. The Kowalski brothers, Ted and Frank, ages 71 and 73 respectively, had never lived apart in their entire lives. Born just 18 months apart to Polish immigrants in Detroit, they'd shared bedrooms, schools, jobs, and eventually the small house their father had bought in 1932. Both men had worked for Ford Motor Company, Ted as a line supervisor, and Frank in quality control, retiring within 6 months of each other in 1979. When Ted suffered a stroke 3 years later, Frank had become his full-time caregiver, learning to cook, manage medications, and assist with physical therapy exercises. The decision to move into Sunset Manor had been devastating for both brothers, representing the first time in their lives. When Frank couldn't provide everything Ted needed, Frank carried enormous guilt about placing his brother in professional care, while Ted struggled with the loss of independence and the burden he felt he'd become. Their chess games and baseball arguments served as comforting rituals that maintained their connection to better times, when their biggest concerns were Tiger's batting averages and weekend fishing trips to Lake Huron. Frank had signed both brothers up for the Death Valley trip, hoping that a shared adventure might restore some of the joy they'd once found in exploring new places together. During their working years, they'd taken annual camping trips to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and Frank remembered how Ted's face would transform when they reached their favorite fishing spots. The Death Valley wildflowers represented Frank's desperate attempt to give his brother one more beautiful memory. Mildred Santos, 82, was the oldest member of the group, and possibly the most enthusiastic about their upcoming adventure. Despite requiring a walker to navigate Sunset Manor's hallways, her mind remained sharp and her curiosity about the world undiminished. Mildred had taught 4th grade for 43 years at the same elementary school in East Los Angeles, earning legendary status among colleagues for her ability to inspire learning in even the most reluctant students. Retirement had been forced upon her at 65, a policy she'd fought unsuccessfully, and she'd spent the intervening years feeling increasingly disconnected from the world of ideas and discovery that had defined her professional life. Mildred's small apartment at Sunset Manor was filled with National Geographic magazines, nature documentaries recorded from PBS, and carefully pressed flowers from the facility's garden. She approached every new experience with the systematic curiosity she'd once tried to instill in her students, taking notes and asking questions that often surprised people who underestimated elderly minds. When Sophia described the geological formations they'd see in Death Valley, Mildred had peppered her with questions about rock formations, mining history, and the ecological adaptations that allowed plants to survive in such extreme conditions. The youngest member of their party was Robert Brown, 68, no relation to Sophia despite their shared surname. Robert had been a successful certified public accountant before early-onset Parkinson's disease forced his retirement at 62. His condition was well managed with medication, but the tremors and occasional balance issues had gradually eroded his confidence in navigating unfamiliar environments. Robert's adult children, David and Lisa, had moved him into Sunset Manor. After a fall in his apartment, convinced them he needed more supervised care than they could provide while managing their own families and careers. Robert's relationship with his diagnosis remained complicated and evolving. Some days he felt like himself with a manageable medical condition, while others he struggled with the identity shift from capable professional to someone who needed assistance opening medication bottles. The Death Valley trip represented a small rebellion against the limitations his disease seemed to impose, a chance to prove to himself and his children that he could still experience adventure and independence. Patricia Williams, 70, brought to the group the complex emotions of someone who had spent her entire career caring for others and now found herself receiving care. Patricia had been a registered nurse for 44 years, working primarily in pediatric intensive care units, where her combination of technical skill and maternal warmth had made her invaluable to patients, families, and colleagues. She'd never married, dedicating herself entirely to her profession and finding deep satisfaction in shepherding sick children back to health. Patricia's transition to Sunset Manor had been precipitated by a combination of arthritis, high blood pressure, and the exhaustion that comes from decades of shift work and emotional intensity. She struggled with being on the receiving end of medical care, often critiquing the nursing staff's techniques and feeling frustrated by her inability to help other residents with their health concerns. The Death Valley trip appealed to Patricia because it represented action and exploration rather than the passive receiving of care that characterized her daily life at the facility. James Morrison, 75, was a widowed mechanic whose hands still moved with practiced precision despite the arthritis that had ended his career. James had owned a small auto repair shop in Riverside for 31 years, building a reputation for honest work and reasonable prices that kept customers returning. For decades, his wife Marie had handled the shop's bookkeeping and customer service, creating a partnership that sustained both their business and their marriage for 47 years. Marie's death from a heart attack 2 years earlier had left James not only grieving, but also struggling with the business aspects of life she'd always managed. He'd sold the repair shop to a younger mechanic who'd worked for him for 8 years, but the transition to retirement and widowerhood had proven more difficult than he'd anticipated. James missed the satisfaction of diagnosing mechanical problems and the social interaction that came with helping customers keep their vehicles running. The Death Valley trip offered a chance to experience landscapes he'd only seen in magazines during the brief breaks he'd taken from work over the years. Susan Liu, 69, had retired to California just 18 months earlier after spending her entire career as a librarian in Minneapolis. Susan's move to the West Coast had been motivated by her desire to be closer to her daughter's family, particularly her 2 granddaughters, whom she'd only seen a few times each year during their Minnesota childhood. The cultural and geographical transition had proven more challenging than Susan had anticipated, as she found herself missing the changing seasons and familiar rhythms of Midwest life. Susan's background in library science had instilled in her a love of systematic learning and careful research. She'd spent weeks preparing for the Death Valley trip, reading everything she could find about the region's geology, history, and ecology. Her small notebook was filled with species lists and historical facts that she hoped to observe and verify during their expedition. For Susan, the trip represented both an educational opportunity and a chance to create new experiences that might help her feel more connected to her adopted California home. Rose Martinez, 72, had spent 46 years married to a long-haul trucker who'd crisscrossed the American West dozens of times each year. While she'd rarely accompanied Eduardo on his trips, Rose had lived vicariously through his stories of mountain passes, desert highways, and small towns that existed primarily to serve the needs of travelers. Eduardo's retirement had lasted only 3 years before a heart attack claimed him, leaving Rose with a pension and a collection of postcards from places she'd never seen but felt she knew through his descriptions. Rose's excitement about the Death Valley trip was tinged with melancholy, as she imagined experiencing landscapes that Eduardo had described but they'd never visited together. She carried with her a small camera that had belonged to her husband, planning to photograph scenes that might match the mental images she'd constructed from his stories. The trip represented both an adventure and a form of pilgrimage, a way of connecting with the traveling life that had defined her marriage, even though she'd experienced it only second-hand. Finally, George Anderson, 71, was a Swedish immigrant who'd arrived in California in 1934 as a 19-year-old seeking work. During the Great Depression, George had found employment as a carpenter's apprentice and had spent the next 42 years building houses, schools, and commercial buildings throughout Southern California. His English retained the slight accent that marked him as foreign-born, though he'd been an American citizen for more than 30 years and had raised 3 children who knew Sweden only through his stories. George's craftsmanship had been legendary among the contractors who employed him, as he brought old-world techniques and an attention to detail that was increasingly rare in modern construction. Retirement had been difficult for George, who missed the satisfaction of creating something permanent and useful with his hands. The Death Valley trip appealed to him partly because of the geological formations Sophia had described, structures created by natural forces that reminded him of the way human hands could shape raw materials into something beautiful and enduring. Each resident brought their own motivations and expectations to the trip, but they shared a common desire to experience something beyond the routine of institutional life. For some, it represented a chance to socialize outside their usual circles. For others, it was an opportunity to see landscapes they'd never experienced. Several family members later recalled their loved ones mentioning the upcoming trip during phone calls, their voices carrying an excitement that had been absent for months or even years. The bus driver assigned to their group was Thomas Garrett, a 58-year-old veteran of senior transportation who'd been driving charter groups for nearly 15 years. Tom had discovered his calling almost by accident, having started driving tour buses as a temporary job after being laid off from a construction company in 1969. What he'd initially viewed as emergency employment had evolved into a career that provided both steady income and genuine satisfaction. Tom's background in construction had given him mechanical skills that proved invaluable in maintaining and troubleshooting bus equipment, while his naturally patient temperament made him ideal for working with elderly passengers who needed extra time and assistance. He'd developed a reputation among Southern California retirement communities for safety, reliability, and the kind of gentle humor that put nervous travelers at ease. Tom understood that driving seniors required a different approach than handling younger tour groups. He drove more slowly, took corners more carefully, and maintained constant awareness of his passengers' comfort levels. His bus had been modified with additional handrails, improved lighting, and cushioned seating that accommodated the physical limitations many elderly travelers experienced. He'd installed a well-stocked first aid kit and had taken a basic medical training course, though in 15 years of driving, he'd never encountered anything more serious than motion sickness or a minor dizzy spell. The route Tom planned for, the Sunset Manor Group, had been one he'd driven dozens of times before with various groups. It would take them along established park roads through some of Death Valley's most spectacular scenery, including stops at Zabriskie Point for panoramic views and Badwater Basin to experience the lowest point in North America. The timing was perfect, as recent winter rains had triggered a rare superbloom of desert wildflowers that painted the valley floor in brilliant yellows, purples, and reds. Tom had been personally recommended by Desert Adventures Tours, the company that Sunset Manor had contracted for the excursion. Sophia had met with him twice to review the planned route and discuss the specific needs of their passengers. During these meetings, Tom had demonstrated the kind of thoughtful preparation that had made him successful with senior groups, asking detailed questions about mobility limitations, medication schedules, and dietary restrictions that might affect their travel comfort. Sophia had coordinated the trip timing with Death Valley's ranger station to ensure optimal wildflower viewing. Park Ranger Julie Martinez, who'd worked in Death Valley for 8 years, had assured her that late March would provide the best combination of mild weather and peak bloom conditions. The rangers were accustomed to senior tour groups and had even suggested a few lesser-known viewpoints that would provide excellent photo opportunities without requiring strenuous hiking. The winter of 1983-84 had been unusually wet throughout Southern California, with a series of Pacific storms bringing the kind of sustained precipitation that Death Valley typically received only once every few years. These rains had awakened dormant seeds that had been waiting in the desert soil for decades, creating the conditions for a wildflower display that park rangers were calling exceptional even by Death Valley standards. On the morning of March 20th, 1984, Sophia arrived at Sunset Manor 2 hours before the scheduled departure to oversee final preparations. She'd spent the previous evening double-checking her passenger list, confirming dietary restrictions, and packing a cooler with extra water bottles and snacks. The retirement home's head nurse, Linda Davidson, had prepared a medical information packet for each passenger, including current medications, emergency contact numbers, and brief descriptions of any conditions that might require special attention during their day-long excursion. Sophia's checklist included backup plans for various contingencies, from weather changes to medical emergencies to mechanical problems. With the bus, she'd coordinated with Sunset Manor's kitchen staff to prepare a lunch that would travel well and accommodate the dietary restrictions of diabetic and heart patients among their group. Her attention to detail reflected both professional training and personal investment in ensuring that her residents had the kind of positive experience that would encourage future adventures. The residents began gathering in Sunset Manor's main lobby shortly after 8 a.m., their excitement palpable despite the early hour. Several had dressed in layers, heeding Sophia's advice about desert temperature fluctuations that could see morning lows in the 50s give way to afternoon highs in the 80s. Others clutched cameras and small day packs containing personal items. They wanted to bring on their adventure. Harold Brennan appeared in the lobby wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, the most animated Sophia had seen him since his wife's funeral. He'd brought a thermos of coffee and a paperback book, as if preparing for a longer journey than the day trip actually entailed. The Kowalski brothers arrived together, Frank pushing Ted's wheelchair while both men engaged in their characteristic banter about who'd remembered to bring extra film for their shared camera. Dorothy Kimmel had prepared for the trip with the Same systematic approach she'd once brought to organizing school field trips, carrying a small notebook to record observations and a pen that she'd tested to ensure it would write reliably in desert conditions. Elena Vasquez stayed close to Dorothy's side, drawing strength from her roommate's confidence while fighting her own nervousness about venturing into unfamiliar territory. Tom Garrett pulled the gleaming white charter bus into Sunset Manors circular driveway at exactly 8:30 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled departure time. The bus was a modern 35-passenger vehicle equipped with air conditioning, comfortable seating, and a small onboard restroom, a feature that Sophia knew would be appreciated by her elderly passengers. Tom completed his standard pre-trip safety inspection, while Sophia gathered her charges for final head count and boarding instructions. The bus inspection was a routine Tom had perfected over years of professional driving, checking fluid levels, tire pressure, safety equipment, and communication devices that would allow him to summon help if needed. The vehicle had been serviced just 3 days earlier and showed no signs of mechanical problems that might compromise their trip. Tom took particular care with the wheelchair lift and accessibility features that would be needed for Ted Kowalski and 2 other residents who used mobility aids. The boarding process took nearly 20 minutes, as several residents required assistance navigating the bus steps despite the vehicle's hydraulic lowering system. Tom demonstrated infinite patience, offering a steady arm to those who needed it and ensuring everyone was securely seated before moving to the next passenger. His gentle manner and encouraging words helped even the most nervous travelers feel uncomfortable about the journey ahead. Sophia walked the aisle with her clipboard, checking off names and distributing small packets containing the day's itinerary, emergency contact information, and brief descriptions of the sites they'd visit. Each packet also included a basic map of Death Valley showing their planned route, along with interesting facts about the desert's geology and ecology that residents could reference during their journey. At 9:07 a.m., with all 12 residents accounted for and comfortably seated, Tom closed the bus doors and began the journey toward Death Valley. Sophia had positioned herself in the front seat directly behind Tom, where she could easily communicate with him and address any passenger concerns that might arise during the trip. The bus was filled with cheerful chatter as residents pointed out landmarks through the windows and shared stories about their previous desert experiences. The first hour of the journey proceeded exactly as planned, following Highway 190 through increasingly arid landscape as they approached Death Valley National Park's boundaries. Tom maintained a steady, comfortable speed that allowed passengers to enjoy the scenery without experiencing the motion discomfort that could affect elderly travelers. His commentary through the bus's PA system was well rehearsed but delivered with genuine enthusiasm that engaged even the quieter passengers. Tom's knowledge of Death Valley's history and geology had been accumulated through years of driving tour, groups and conversations with park rangers, geologists, and local historians who'd ridden his bus. He could explain the formation of alluvial fans, describe the mining booms and busts that had shaped the region's human history, and identify the wildlife and plant species that had adapted to desert conditions. His explanations were pitched at a level that informed without overwhelming, perfect for passengers who wanted to learn without feeling like they were attending a college lecture. They stopped at their first scheduled destination, Zabriskie Point, at 10:45 a.m. The viewpoint offered sweeping vistas of Death Valley's otherworldly badlands, where erosion had carved the ancient lakebed sediments into a maze of ridges and valleys that stretched to the horizon. The residents spent 30 minutes taking photographs and marveling at the dramatic landscape, many commenting that the reality exceeded anything they'd seen in magazines or documentaries. Tom helped several passengers who had difficulty walking on the uneven surfaces around the viewing area, while Sophia ensured that everyone stayed together and no one wandered too close to the unfenced cliff edges. The safety briefing she'd given during the bus ride proved its worth, as residents demonstrated awareness of the potential dangers while still enjoying the spectacular views. Susan Liu, the retired librarian from Minnesota, seemed particularly enchanted by the stark beauty of the desert landscape. She'd grown up surrounded by lakes and forests, where green dominated the color palette and water was never far away. The alien landscape of Death Valley represented something entirely outside her previous experience, challenging her assumptions. About what constituted beautiful or livable terrain, George Anderson, the Swedish carpenter, struck up a conversation with Tom about the geological processes that had created the colorful rock formations visible from Zabriskie Point. Despite his accent, George's questions were insightful, demonstrating the same attention to structural details that had made him successful in construction. Tom found himself explaining concepts about tectonic activity and erosion that went well beyond his usual tourist commentary, delighted to encounter a passenger whose curiosity matched his own enthusiasm for the subject. At 11:30 a.m., the group reboarded the bus for the drive to their next scheduled stop at Badwater Basin Salt Flats. This portion of the journey would take them deeper into Death Valley proper, where they'd experience the full impact of the desert environment and, hopefully, encounter the wildflower displays that had motivated the timing of their trip. Tom estimated the drive would take approximately 45 minutes, putting them at Badwater Basin shortly after noon for lunch and exploration. The road between Zabriskie Point and Badwater Basin wound through some of Death Valley's most dramatic terrain, following the valley floor between towering mountain ranges that rose abruptly from the desert floor. The Panamint Mountains to the west and the Amargosa Range to the east created a natural corridor that channeled weather patterns and influenced the distribution of the rare rainfall that sustained desert life. Tom drove slowly through this section, allowing his passengers to fully appreciate the scale and grandeur of the landscape while pointing out significant landmarks and geological features. He described how the mountains had been formed by tectonic forces, how flash floods had carved the alluvial fans spreading from the canyon mouths, and how the valley's unique climate created the conditions for both the harshest and most spectacular desert phenomena. About 20 minutes into this segment of their journey, Dorothy Kimmel, the former high school principal, noticed something unusual about the vegetation they were passing. Having spent her career in education, Dorothy possessed the observational skills and intellectual curiosity that had made her an effective administrator. She raised her hand to get Tom's attention and asked why the plant communities seemed different. From what they'd observed at Zabriskie Point, Tom glanced in his rearview mirror to see which area Dorothy was referring to, then smiled and launched into an explanation about elevation changes and microclimate zones within Death Valley. He described how differences of just a few hundred feet in elevation could create dramatically different growing conditions, allowing different plant species to thrive in seemingly similar environments. The concept of ecological zones was new to most of his passengers, and his explanation prompted additional questions from several other residents. Rose Martinez asked about the types of animals that lived in such apparently barren terrain, leading Tom to describe the nocturnal habits of desert wildlife and the adaptations that allowed creatures to survive extreme temperatures and water scarcity. Mildred Santos wanted to know about the life cycles of desert plants, particularly how they timed their reproduction to coincide with rare rainfall events. It was during this period of animated discussion about desert ecology that Tom first noticed the small brown sedan that had been following them for several miles. The car maintained a consistent distance behind the bus, neither attempting to pass nor falling significantly behind, despite the relatively slow pace Tom was maintaining for his elderly passengers' comfort. While it wasn't unusual to encounter other vehicles on Death Valley's main roads, something about this particular car's behavior struck Tom as odd. The sedan's driver appeared to be a middle-aged man traveling alone, but the distance and angle made it difficult for Tom to discern additional details through his mirrors. The car bore California license plates and appeared to be a late-model vehicle in good condition, suggesting a tourist rather than a local resident. However, the driver's decision to maintain such a consistent following distance rather than simply passing the slower-moving bus seemed peculiar, given the clear road conditions ahead. Tom mentioned the following car to Sophia, partly as a matter of professional caution and partly because it represented an unusual element in what had otherwise been a routine charter trip. Sophia turned in her seat to look through the bus's rear window, confirming Tom's observation about the sedan's persistent presence behind them. Both agreed to monitor the situation, but saw no immediate cause for concern, as the driver's behavior seemed more cautious than threatening. As they continued toward Badwater Basin, the conversation among the passengers turned to their lunch plans and expectations for the afternoon portion of their trip. Sophia had coordinated with Sunset Manor's kitchen staff to pack a lunch that would travel well in desert conditions while accommodating the various dietary restrictions among their group. The menu included sandwiches made with low-sodium lunch, meat for residents with high blood pressure, fresh fruit that wouldn't spoil in warm temperatures, and plenty of water and juice to maintain proper hydration. Several residents had brought cameras and were already planning the photographs they wanted to take at Badwater Basin. Harold Brennan mentioned that he'd promised his daughter Patricia he would send her pictures from the trip, the first time he'd expressed interest in documenting experiences since his wife's death. The Kowalski brothers were debating the best camera angles for capturing the salt flat formations, their shared enthusiasm for the project reflecting the kind of collaborative planning that had characterized their entire relationship. Rose Martinez shared stories about her late husband's cross-country routes that had occasionally taken him through Death Valley during his trucking career. She described his accounts of the desert's harsh beauty and the respect it demanded from travelers who underestimated its power. Her stories resonated with several other passengers who had their own connections to desert travel, creating a sense of shared adventure and discovery that Sophia found deeply satisfying. The conversation was interrupted when Tom noticed that the brown sedan had suddenly accelerated and was now attempting to pass the bus on a straight stretch of road. This seemed like normal highway behavior, and Tom slowed slightly to allow the car to pass safely. However, as the sedan drew alongside the bus, its driver began honking his horn and gesturing frantically toward Tom and Sophia through his passenger window. Through the sedan's windows, Tom could see a man in his 50s wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, his face animated with apparent urgency. The man was pointing ahead of them and shouting something that was inaudible over the bus engine and road noise. His gestures seemed to indicate danger or concern about something in their planned route, but the specific nature of his warning remained unclear due to the communication barriers created by their separate vehicles. Tom carefully reduced the bus's speed and activated his hazard lights, looking for a safe place to pull over and communicate with the agitated driver. The sedan's driver matched Tom's deceleration, continuing to honk and gesture while keeping pace with the bus. Several passengers had noticed the commotion and were craning their necks to see what was happening outside, their earlier relaxed mood giving way to curiosity and growing concern. Sophia stood up and walked to one of the bus's side windows, trying to better understand what the sedan's driver was attempting to communicate. The man appeared genuinely distressed rather than hostile, and his persistent efforts to gain their attention suggested legitimate concern rather than road rage or random harassment. However, the nature of his warning remained frustratingly unclear. Despite his increasingly frantic gestures, Tom spotted a wide area beside the road where he could safely pull the bus over without blocking traffic or placing his passengers in danger from passing vehicles. He activated his turn signal and gradually brought the vehicle to a stop on the shoulder while the brown sedan pulled in directly behind them. The bus's passengers watched with curiosity and growing concern as the sedan's driver quickly exited his vehicle and approached the bus doors. The man identified himself as David Reeves, a Death Valley Park maintenance worker who was off-duty but traveling through the area on personal business. David explained that he'd been monitoring his radio scanner and had heard reports of flash flood warnings for several areas of the park, including some sections along their planned route to Badwater Basin. While the current weather seemed clear and calm, David knew from experience how quickly conditions could change in Death Valley's unique environment. David's warning carried particular weight because of his professional familiarity with Death Valley's weather patterns and flooding risks. He explained that winter storms in the surrounding mountains could create dangerous runoff conditions hours or even days after the precipitation had ended in the high country. These flash floods could transform normally dry washes and low-lying areas into torrents, capable of sweeping away vehicles and creating impassable road conditions with little advance warning. The concept of flash floods in apparently dry terrain was foreign to most of the bus passengers who associated flooding with visible rain and obvious water sources. David took time to explain how desert hydrology worked differently from the water cycles they'd experienced in more temperate climates, where rainfall typically soaked into soil or ran off gradually into established drainage systems. Tom thanked David for the warning and consulted his route maps to identify alternative paths to their destination that would avoid the potentially problematic areas. David offered to share his knowledge of current road conditions and suggested a different route that would still allow the group to reach Badwater Basin safely while avoiding the washes and low-lying areas where floodwaters might present hazards. This alternative route would add approximately 30 minutes to their travel time, but would take them through equally scenic terrain. After conferring with Sophia and briefly explaining the situation to their passengers, Tom decided to follow David's recommended detour. The residents seemed reassured by Tom's cautious approach and David's professional expertise, viewing the route change as an additional adventure rather than a serious inconvenience. Several passengers commented that the flexibility to explore new areas made their trip feel more like a genuine exploration than a rigid tour. David provided detailed directions for the alternative route, using landmarks and mile markers that would be easy for Tom to identify and follow. He also offered to lead them partway along the new route to ensure they stayed on the correct roads, a gesture that demonstrated the kind of helpful attitude that characterized many Death Valley employees who understood the potential dangers. Facing unprepared visitors, the modified route took them along a series of lesser-used park roads that offered different but equally spectacular views of Death Valley's diverse landscape. Instead of following the main valley floor, they would travel through higher elevation terrain that provided broader vistas and different geological formations. David led the way in his sedan for the first 20 minutes, maintaining radio contact with Tom through CB channels to provide ongoing guidance and updates about road conditions ahead. The slower pace required by the unfamiliar roads actually enhanced the passengers' sightseeing experience, as Tom had more time to point out geological features and wildlife that might have been missed at higher speeds. The new route took them past several small canyons, where hardy desert plants had established themselves in the protected microclimates created by rock formations and seasonal water sources. About 40 minutes into their detour, David's sedan, reached the point where he needed to turn off toward his own destination. He pulled alongside the bus one final time to confirm that Tom was comfortable with the remaining directions and to provide additional guidance about recognizing landmarks along their route. David also gave Tom his radio frequency and encouraged him to make contact if they encountered any problems or needed further assistance during the remainder of their journey. As David's sedan disappeared around a bend in the road, Tom felt confident about proceeding with the remainder of their modified route. The directions were clear, the road conditions seemed excellent, and his passengers appeared to be enjoying the unexpected variation in their planned itinerary. Sophia checked her watch and confirmed that despite the detour, they would still arrive at Badwater Basin within a reasonable time frame for their scheduled lunch and exploration. The landscape along their new route proved to be dramatically different from the main park roads they'd originally planned to travel. Narrow canyons alternated with open valleys, creating a constantly changing panorama that kept the passengers engaged and commenting on the scenery. The higher elevation provided views across Death Valley that revealed the scale of the desert in ways that weren't apparent from the valley floor. Tom found himself providing commentary about geological formations and desert ecology that went well beyond his usual tour script, inspired by the unique features they encountered along the alternative route. The detour had transformed their standard tour into a more intimate exploration of Death Valley's hidden landscapes, creating the kind of discovery experience that made the day memorable for both passengers and driver. It was during this portion of their journey that the first signs of trouble began to manifest, though none of the bus occupants immediately recognized them as warning signs of impending disaster. Tom began experiencing what he initially attributed to altitude-related discomfort, a slight tightness in his chest that he assumed was related to the elevation changes as they moved through the mountainous terrain surrounding Death Valley proper. Tom had experienced similar sensations during previous high-altitude trips and had developed techniques for managing the discomfort through controlled breathing and maintaining proper hydration. He quietly adjusted his driving position to relieve what he assumed was muscle tension and focused on maintaining steady breathing patterns while continuing to navigate the unfamiliar roads and provide commentary for his passengers. The chest discomfort was subtle enough that Tom convinced himself it represented nothing more than the normal physical stress of driving unfamiliar roads while maintaining responsibility for 12 elderly passengers. His professional training emphasized the importance of completing assigned trips safely, and the possibility of cutting short their carefully planned excursion seemed unthinkable given the excitement his passengers had shown for their Death Valley adventure. Sophia noticed that Tom seemed slightly less talkative than usual, but attributed this to his concentration on the new route and the responsibility of safely navigating roads he hadn't previously driven with a bus full of elderly passengers. She continued to engage the residents in conversation about the scenery and their upcoming lunch plans, maintaining the cheerful atmosphere that had characterized their trip from the beginning. The passengers remained completely oblivious to any developing problems, absorbed in their sightseeing and the social dynamics of their group outing. Harold Brennan had struck up a conversation with James Morrison about their respective military service experiences during the Korean War, discovering shared memories of basic training and overseas deployment that created an instant bond between the two men. The Kowalski brothers continued their ongoing debate about baseball statistics, their discussion ranging from Ty Cobb's batting averages to the architectural merits of various stadiums they'd visited during their working years in Detroit. Their animated conversation drew smiles from other passengers who appreciated the brothers' obvious affection for each other, despite their constant arguing. Susan Liu was taking detailed notes in a small journal, apparently recording her impressions of the desert landscape for later reflection and possible sharing with her granddaughters in California. Her systematic approach to documenting their experience reflected her library science background and her desire to create lasting memories from their adventure. As they continued along the detour route, Tom began to notice that his chest discomfort was intensifying rather than diminishing as he'd expected. The sensation had evolved from a minor tightness to a more persistent pressure that seemed unrelated to altitude, breathing patterns, or muscle tension. However, his professional training and personal commitment to passenger safety prevented him from acknowledging the possibility that he might be experiencing a serious medical emergency. Tom's primary concern remained the safe completion of their trip and the well-being of his 12 elderly passengers who had been planning this excursion for months. He convinced himself that his symptoms represented nothing more than stress and fatigue, conditions that could be managed through willpower and professional discipline until they reached their destination and completed their scheduled activities. The first road they were following had begun to trend downward into a broad valley that Tom assumed would eventually connect with the main Death Valley floor near their destination. According to David's directions, they should encounter a prominent landmark within the next 10 miles that would confirm they were on the correct route toward Badwater Basin. Tom focused on maintaining proper speed and watching for this landmark. While trying to ignore his increasing physical discomfort, Sophia began preparing for their lunch stop by gathering information about the residents' dietary needs and preferences. Several passengers had special requirements related to diabetes, heart conditions, or medications that affected their appetites, and she wanted to ensure that everyone could participate fully in their picnic meal. Her attention to these administrative details prevented her from noticing the subtle changes in Tom's driving behavior as he unconsciously began compensating for his growing distress. The bus had been traveling along a relatively straight section of road when Tom suddenly experienced a sharp intensification of his chest pain, accompanied by shortness of breath and a sensation of overwhelming pressure that he could no longer ignore or rationalize away. The symptoms struck with such sudden severity that he temporarily lost focus on his driving, causing the bus to drift slightly toward the road's shoulder before he regained control through sheer force of will. Tom's brief loss of control went unnoticed by most passengers, who were engaged in conversation or gazing out the windows at the passing scenery. However, Sophia, positioned directly behind the driver's seat, sensed something was wrong when she felt the bus's movement become less smooth and noticed Tom's posture change as he gripped the steering wheel more tightly and leaned forward slightly. Before Sophia could inquire about what was happening or offer assistance, Tom suffered what would later be determined as a massive cardiac event. The sudden onset of the heart attack caused him to lose consciousness while the bus was traveling at approximately 35 miles per hour along a road that had begun curving toward what appeared to be a scenic overlook area. The driverless bus continued forward under its own momentum, following the road's curve for several hundred yards as Tom slumped unconscious over the steering wheel. The vehicle's trajectory carried it past the intended overlook area and toward a series of dirt tracks that led into the desert wilderness beyond the established park boundaries. Sophia realized something was seriously wrong when she felt the bus leave the paved road surface and begin bouncing over increasingly rough terrain. She immediately called out to Tom, but received no response. Moving carefully forward to check on the driver while the bus continued moving, she discovered Tom slumped unconscious over the steering wheel, his face gray and his breathing labored and irregular. The passengers began to understand that they were in serious trouble as the bus continued deeper into unmapped desert terrain, guided only by the natural contours of what appeared to be an ancient watercourse. Several residents called out in alarm, while others struggled to comprehend what was happening as their pleasant tour suddenly transformed into a crisis situation. Sophia attempted to reach the bus's controls, but her unfamiliarity with the vehicle's systems and the continuing forward motion made it impossible to safely stop or steer the bus. The steering wheel was pinned beneath Tom's unconscious body, and her attempts to rouse him or move him aside were unsuccessful given the confined space and the bus's bouncing movement over rough ground. The terrain they were crossing consisted of loose sand and scattered rocks, with occasional desert vegetation that scraped against the bus's sides as it followed what appeared to be a natural drainage channel leading away from the road. The bus's momentum carried them forward for nearly a mile into this remote area before the landscape began to change dramatically. What had started as relatively open desert gradually gave way to more broken terrain as they entered the mouth of a canyon system that wasn't marked on any tourist maps. The canyon walls rose slowly at first, then more steeply as the bus followed the ancient watercourse deeper into the mountain foothills. The vehicle's forward progress slowed as the terrain became increasingly challenging, but its weight and momentum continued to carry it forward along the path of least resistance. The passengers were now fully aware that they were in grave danger, though the specific nature of their situation remained unclear to most of them. Some called out suggestions or instructions, while others sat in stunned silence as they watched the canyon walls grow higher around them. Sophia continued her desperate attempts to gain control of the bus, while also trying to provide reassurance to the terrified residents. As the bus penetrated deeper into the narrow canyon, the walls began to close in on both sides, creating an increasingly confined passage that would ultimately prove inescapable. The vehicle's progress slowed further as it encountered larger rocks and steeper grades, but the downward trend of the canyon floor continued to pull them forward toward an unknown destination. The sound of scraping metal became constant as the bus's sides made contact with the canyon walls, but the vehicle's structural integrity remained intact. Inside, passengers held onto their seats as the bouncing and tilting motion created a terrifying sense of helplessness. Sophia's training in crisis management helped her maintain some composure, but the specialized nature of their situation exceeded anything she'd been prepared to handle. 21 years later, experienced hikers Marcus Lewis and Jennifer Walsh were exploring the unmapped sections of Death Valley's extensive canyon network when they stumbled upon something that would finally solve one of the region's most enduring mysteries. Marcus, a geologist who specialized in desert terrain formation, and Jennifer, a wilderness photographer documenting previously uncharted areas of the park, had been following GPS coordinates that led them into regions not covered by official park maps. The two hikers had been documenting interesting rock formations and geological features in a narrow gorge that appeared to have been carved by ancient flash floods when Jennifer noticed something metallic reflecting sunlight from deeper within the canyon. Initially assuming it was debris left by recent flooding, they approached the object with casual curiosity rather than any expectation of significant discovery. What they found, preserved by Death Valley's arid climate and protected from the elements by the canyon's steep walls, would answer questions that had haunted investigators, families, and an entire community for more than 2 decades. The white charter bus sat exactly where momentum and canyon walls had trapped it 21 years earlier, its exterior faded by sun and wind, but structurally intact, containing the preserved remains of 12 elderly residents and their driver, who had simply been seeking to experience the beauty of desert wildflowers in bloom.